Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today's guest is a leading teacher, author, and activist of our time. He is a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, and he has worked to end, among other things, homelessness, war, nuclear weapons, and more. He has been instrumental in bringing nonviolence to the mainstream, working with the Vatican, and traveling all over the world to speak. And he has worked for Pace Bene for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, Ken Butigan. Thank you so much for being here.
Really happy to be here, Rosie. Thanks for having
me. Thanks. So, Ken, as I've met people in the peace community, I'm amazed by how many of them talk about Daniel Butigan and pivotal conversations that they've had with him. And I loved reading about the conversation that you had with him in his apartment about his advice to you, which said, find some people that you can pray and march with. And so I know that you did, and I'm wondering, what has this meant in your life, this combination of prayer and marching, and what would you say to young people about acting together rather than alone?
Well, thanks so much. Of course, Daniel Butigan is one of the great people who ever lived, who committed himself so passionately to a world where everyone counts, and a passionate commitment to prophetic nonviolence. And he taught me so much about that process. And maybe I'd say a little bit about that first. I didn't start out as an activist. I did not come from a political family. I decided, after having a religious experience in my senior year in college, that I wanted to get to know God. And I thought, well, one of the best ways to do that is to study God. And that led me to a master's degree program at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And so I was moving along in that master's program. And then I met all of these crazy, wacky people who were taking Jesus seriously when he said, love your enemies. I met, in particular, this wonderful human being, Terry Messman, who had spent 6 months in federal prison for simply crossing a line at an intercontinental ballistic missile base in Montana. It was a very interesting story. He was a reporter with a local paper, and he went out to cover a particular nonviolent action where a minister on Easter morning was going to engage in civil disobedience at this site. Crossed the line, sat down. Terry saw this. He dropped his notepad and sat down right next to the minister. As I said, this netted him 6 months in federal prison. So I met Terry, and I was not engaged in any kind of resistance or nonviolent struggle, but he moved me a great deal. And so I was thinking, well, I'll check this out. Terry and others were organizing a nonviolence training because some of them were going to be taking action at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, about 40 miles where we were, east of Berkeley. And it's designed 50% of the US nuclear arsenal. So I took this nonviolence training, knowing nothing about nonviolence, knowing nothing about civil resistance. I took this training, and about halfway through it, I was just so moved by his passion and by the passion of all those people who were involved in it. I said, this is something I think I want to do. So I engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience the following Monday, but there was no Terry. And I thought, well, that is so bad. He talks the talk, but doesn't walk the walk. Well, after I was arrested in this nice little circle we had in front of the gates of the lab, I was put in a holding cell with the others, who were about 30. About 45 minutes later, 2 officers dragged Terry into the holding cell. And it turns out what he had done is he'd gone over the fence, walked over to one of the buildings where they're designing nuclear weapons. There was an outside stairwell. He walked to the top of it. He tried the door and it was open. He walked in. He saw all these printouts of nuclear weapons designs on the tables there. He started taking big piles of them and tossing them out the door, and they went fluttering down into the air. He did this for about 15 minutes, and somebody said, you don't belong here, do you? At which point a sheriff burst through the door, pointed a gun at him, got him down on the floor, and dragged him through while he's saying the Our Father at the top of his lungs. So he's dragged into our holding cell. He tells us this story. Everyone else is very upset with him because he had said nothing about doing this to them. Maybe they would get higher charges because they're associated with him. I had no idea about movement politics. I just was very moved by what he had done. So we got a little week-long sentence for doing that action. And that was my little baptism. And then Terry and I joined a number of other people. We formed something called Spirit Affinity Group. And we just did one wacky, beautiful, transplendent, nonviolent, but very creative action after another for the next couple of years. And I shouldn't tell people in high school or college this, but I basically put my studies on the shelf for 2 years, and we did one thing after another. The bottom line is that we have more power than we think. And virtually every social movement has been led by young people. The importance and power of young people seeing a vision of a world where everyone can count, where injustice has no place. And I encourage everyone to do what you can to act your way into thinking. So what did I learn? I learned that there's a practice and an approach called active, creative, liberating, challenging nonviolence. I found out I couldn't do this by myself. If I try to change the world by myself, I'll be destroyed by it. So I need other cranky, beautiful, resilient human beings to do this. So find yourself a group and experiment in this nonviolent action. That's what I think.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, during these days of protests, right now we're having a lot of protests against police brutality. And we're hearing a lot about defunding police departments and rerouting money to community-centered action. For example, increasing funding for public schools, mental health treatment, and substance abuse treatment, among other things. And how do you feel as you hear this unfolding news?
Well, I'm extremely excited. We need to fund all the human needs that are out there. And as Willie Loman, a bank robber, was asked, well, why did you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money was. So where's the money today? Well, it's going into things like the military and in these police departments across the country. We need those resources to fund all the things you mentioned and beyond. We need a more nonviolent society. And then people say, well, how will we deal with security? We will create a whole other way of meeting the security needs in our society. Often police are sent out when, in fact, we need to send mental health workers out to deal with many of the situations that people see. At the same time, there's mutual aid. We can create that in our societies. The big problem, one of the big problems of racist police departments is that they've been armed and militarized. And that has to stop. And so I wrote a piece recently on the mayor of Washington, D.C.'s decision to paint the words Black Lives Matter on the streets just yards away from the White House. And then that was edited by Black Lives Matter DC that said, defund the police. That they made that addition in the streets. I think it's really important. Any of these changes will happen not because some of us think it's a good idea, but because we create movements that will make that happen. So I, as an ally, want to support these efforts of young people and older people who want to see a more just and nonviolent infrastructure in our society. You know, I often teach this course called Nonviolent Chicago. And clearly that's going to, if we're going to have a nonviolent Chicago, I happen to live in Chicago, yeah. Then we're probably going to need nonviolent security services or some other version of what we have here. And I was inspired, this idea of a nonviolent Chicago, I got inspired by the fact that in 2012, in November of 2012, the media reported that for a 24-hour period, there was no violent crime reported in the city of New York, in all 5 boroughs, the largest city in the United States. No violent crime was reported. And I read that, and it didn't mean that there was no violence, but no violent crime had been reported. And I thought to myself, well, that was without any kind of training or any kind of planning or strategies, but it's possible in a city of 12 or 15 million people to report no violent crime. What would it be like if we actually organized for that? What if we actually organized each other for that? And so one of the thoughts that I've often had is, let's have a day without violence and a day for nonviolence globally. And let's learn from that. Let's organize that. And if we did that, maybe we'd say, well, how about a week? How about a month? How about a year? How about the rest of the century? Yeah. Now, when I say nonviolence like that, I'm talking about this idea of mainstreaming nonviolence. And I don't mean by that being co-opted by the system, becomes a fad. Yeah. I also don't mean a full utopia. I actually mean that all of us, or more and more of us, get equipped with the vision, the tools, the practices, the infrastructure of a more just and peaceful and nonviolent society. And I think that's quite doable. And actually, we have largely seen nonviolent demonstrations over the last couple of weeks all across the country, even though the media has liked to focus in on certain acts of violence. Increasingly, this particular movement has seen the wisdom in maintaining this nonviolence. And that was planned in some ways, but spontaneous in others. We can actually plan that. We can actually organize that.
Yeah, and that leads really well into my next question. I love this phrase that you use, mainstreaming nonviolence. And so it's wonderful to reflect on how when society decides that something is vital, it eventually steadily becomes the norm. And so can you explain to us, you already did a little, but I'd love to hear, I want to hear more about your vision for mainstreaming nonviolence.
Yeah. So I believe we're living in the golden age of nonviolence. And it's been accelerating over the last century. Although, as Gandhi said, nonviolence is as old as the hills. We would not have made it as a species if we had been using violence all the time. Because what we know about violence is that it escalates and it trips out of control, and it doesn't really solve the problems. It kicks those real problems down the road. And so you have to deal with them some way. And if you keep thinking violence is going to be the answer, it's going to be extremely destructive. I quite believe that we would have destroyed ourselves millennia ago or longer, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, if it had just been for using violence. So nonviolence has been with us all along. It hasn't gotten the press that it needs. It hasn't had the stories and the history and the accounting for that. But probably every nanosecond we've been using nonviolence to keep that from tripping out of control. So what is nonviolence? Well, we're fortunate that in this century, we've put our minds more to it to understand this thing that's been there all along. But when you understand something and actually use a term, it begins to spread. So, for example, Dr. King, I love one of his many descriptions of nonviolence is the love that does justice. Sometimes we put love over here and justice over here. He smushes them together. He says, you can't have love without justice. You can't have justice without love. So that's one of his descriptions of nonviolence. A group called Alternatives to Violence calls it transforming power. This great historian, Jonathan Schell, who's organized and studied the history of nonviolence, calls it cooperative power. And Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, called it love in action. We at Pachabene have called it a force for transformation, for justice, and the well-being of all that's neither violent nor passive. It's a stand against violence without using violence. And the War Resisters League calls it an active form of resistance to systems of privilege and domination, a philosophy for liberation, an approach to movement building, a tactic of non-cooperation, and a practice we can employ to transform the world. So when I think about all those descriptions, for me, I've kind of crystallized this into the following description. Nonviolence is a constructive force, an active method, and a powerful way of life that challenges violence without using violence, transforms and resolves conflict, and fosters justice, peace, and reconciliation. So then you ask, well, how do we make that the norm or the default? And what would that look like? Well, what I'd say, Rosie, is that we're standing at such a crossroads right now. And that has been illuminated both by COVID-19 that shows the very unjust infrastructure in this country and around the world, so that there is not healthcare for all, so that there is not an economic safety net for all, so that we are spending money on things that really don't help us in crises like that, like the military and the police. But then also the very creative crisis that the movement in response to the heinous death of George Floyd is showing us that the racism of that unjust system absolutely has to be challenged and transformed and dismantled, because Black Lives Matter and because a white supremacy and white privilege has kept that in place going on 400 years. So we have the need, we have the history, but now we are at a crossroads. And it will not happen by itself. It will take ordinary people like you and me and many others to say, I want to learn this stuff. I want to practice this stuff. I want to experiment with this stuff. And I want to join with others to build a more nonviolent society. And as I've been saying, to mainstream nonviolence, to make it that norm, to make it as the default, to put it at the center of our values and the way we're going to be with one another, is not to say that utopia is around the corner. What it is to say is that we have the capacity, all of us, to put this love into action, and that we can find the tools and the resources so that when we face conflicts in our daily life, or we face conflicts in our community, we face conflicts that flow from the injustice of the structures in our city and our nation and our world, that we're equipped to do that. So it's really about helping us see that there's the capacity, that there's the possibility, and that each of us can play a role in making that happen.
Wow, thank you, Ken. And so, as my last question, what does nonviolence mean to you?
It took me a while to not only understand it, but to experience it. So I was, as I said, I was a graduate student 1.2 million years ago in California. And I had an experience where I received a letter in the mail. It was from somebody from Nicaragua. And at that time, the United States government, under the Reagan administration, was prosecuting a horrific war against the people of Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And I knew something about that, but I got this letter from somebody had gotten my address somehow from Nicaragua. And I opened it and I was, kind of reading it. And it was talking about the horrific war that the US was waging against the people there. I knew some of that. I had read some of that. I'd heard about it. But about halfway down the letter, it said, "We're telling you now. So 10 years from now, you cannot say you did not know. Do everything in your power to stop this carnage." And I looked up from the letter, and I had a vision. This person who had written to me was standing in front of me, holding a dying child, had been attacked. And the vision faded, and I said, well, what can I do? What can one person do to respond to this horror? And then I remember reading an article about a group of people who had committed themselves to engage in nonviolent action if the US went to war against Nicaragua, if it invaded Nicaragua. And they were going to go to the border of Nicaragua and just stand there in the way of the invasion. But if they were not able to do that, they would proceed to federal buildings and engage in nonviolent action to withdraw their consent from that and to raise their concerns. And that was 50 people who'd made that commitment. And I said to myself, 50 people, why not 500 people? Why not 500,000 people? And so I sat down and I wrote a little commitment that I would make to engage in nonviolent action. And I began to show it around to people. And eventually, some of us began to organize around that. And we also organized with Sojourner magazine in Washington, D.C., because they were having a similar kind of idea. And together, we put our heads together and we organized something called the Pledge of Resistance. And for about the next 8 years of my life, I spent as an organizer, had no training as an organizer. I acted my way into thinking. I was always the person who sat in the back of the class and never said anything. It was like that. So I had to maladapt. I'm an introvert, basically. I had to maladapt. And so we started organizing, and we built a movement with about 100,000 people took that pledge. This was before the internet.
Wow.
And online petitions and so on. We organized ourselves into 10 regions across the country. We built 400 local groups, and we organized an emergency response anytime the U.S. escalated its intervention in Central America. So we organized lots of demonstrations. Lots of us went to jail many times. And that taught me, Rosie, what nonviolence is, because you had to be nonviolent with one another in organizing, but you also had to use the strategies of nonviolence to alert, educate, win, and mobilize the populace. And I discovered that nonviolent strategies are very effective at doing that. And so, so nonviolence means that we are going to transform us versus them dynamics. We're all in this. I always have this image of a circle of care that just keeps moving out infinitely, and that we're all in that circle of care, and that nonviolence says, not only are we going to have that conviction, we're actually going to make that real and possible. And often every day we have to use that dynamic of nonviolence in our relationships, but also in this idea of the long-term effort, the long-term work of building a culture of peace and nonviolence, free from war, free from poverty, free from racism, free from environmental destruction, all the forms of structural violence. Also, I think I like this this quote from Allen Ginsberg at the end of one of his poems. Now, he was a poet in the 20th century. He was also just a crazy, wonderful shaman character. He says at the end of one of his poems, "While we're here, we'll do the work." And what's the work? To ease the pain of living. Everything else is a drunken dumb show, a puppet show. While we're here, we'll do the work to ease the pain of living, but also to celebrate the joy of being together, of overcoming us versus them attitudes that are destructive, that separation that keeps us from being as human as we can be. We're here to ease the pain of living and to actually totally revel in and enjoy this life with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so you asked me what nonviolence is. That's what nonviolence is for me.
Oh, thank you, Ken. Thank you for sharing, and thank you so much for being here today. It's been such an honor to talk with you, and thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Rosie, for being with Pace Bene and being in organizing this and many other interviews, and the work you're doing for a more just, peaceful, and nonviolent world. Thank you for that.
Thank you.